They pulled me off the plane because I was the wrong person. They didn't know who I was or why this moment would be a disaster for the entire aviation industry. They thought I was just another passenger who wasn't following the rules. But when they took me away, I pressed the button that changed everything. And now I'm ready to take their business, their money, and their illusions because they chose the wrong victim. My fight for justice starts right now. I was sitting in 3A, in first class, on an expensive plane that was supposed to take me to San Francisco for an important meeting. But that wasn't the only thing that was important to me. What was important was how I got here, how much I had to go through to be among the few who could afford first class. All these years I worked tirelessly, proving my worth, and finally, well-deserved comfort. But at that moment, everything came crashing down. The flight attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile, approached me. Her voice was formal but cold. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave this seat," she said, her expression unchanged. I raised my head, struggling to hide my surprise. "What? You want me to move to another seat?" "No." She glanced at the other passengers. "You have to get off the plane." "I'm sorry, but this is my seat, and I have the right to stay here." I tried to remain calm, but her insistence made my heart beat faster. There was not just stubbornness in her voice, but contempt. The flight attendant did not respond, but her gaze became a little colder. She began to glance at my boarding pass every few seconds, as if doubting my right to be there. I decided not to give in. My opinion was simple. I had paid for this ticket. I had all the necessary documents, I was a free person, and no one could tell me where to sit. But the situation got much worse when two men in uniform, security guards, approached my row. One of them looked familiar. I had noticed him before I sat down. He looked at me, all friendliness gone from his face, and his gaze became appraising. "You have to leave the plane," he said, without even asking if I understood what was happening. His tone was sharp, almost commanding. On what grounds? I felt anger welling up inside me. Not just anger, but anger that had been building up all my life. I wasn't going to put up with being pushed out of my seat without any explanation. There have been complaints from other passengers. We have every reason to check. It was like a punch in the stomach. Couldn't they just say that because of my dark skin and wrong appearance, I had no right to be in first class? I clenched my teeth, but my eyes became stern. They had just shown their true colors, and I wasn't going to put up with it. "I'm not leaving," I said firmly, looking them in the eye. I could feel the other passengers staring at me. I was the center of attention. Several people whispered among themselves. Others tried to record the situation on their phones. I didn't like it, but at that moment I realized this wasn't just my fight. It was a fight for those who face this every day. The security guards weren't surprised by my refusal. They seemed to have been expecting it. One of the men took a step toward me, already holding a special form to force me to leave. "You must leave the plane. If you don't go voluntarily, we will be forced to take action." I felt my heart beating faster, but I wasn't going to back down. This was my truth, and I couldn't stay silent, even when it got scary. My mind was clear, and I knew that this moment would change everything. They had no right to pressure me. "Why?" I repeated the question, not looking away. "Why should I leave? Because I don't look like you? This isn't your place. This is my place." I knew they were trying to intimidate me, but all I could do was stand firm as a rock. I was ready to go all the way. My plan was clear. It had to look like a simple situation, but behind it was a system that had been bullying people like me for years. I wasn't going to stay silent. I decided that today I would fight not only for myself, but for all those who had not been hurt. This was my chance. My chance to stop this injustice before it got even worse. I quickly took out my phone and started recording what was happening. This would be my proof, my weapon. They were already dragging me to the exit when I clearly said that I wanted to talk to the captain of the plane. All these moments that they tried to impose on me, I knew that the moment would come when I would show the world what it's like when you're just trying to fly and you're being humiliated because of the color of your skin. I didn't need to be silent anymore. I pressed the button on my phone and sent the recording to my lawyer, knowing that this moment would change everything. Not just my life, but the lives of millions of people who until then had been unable to express their pain. I walked through the terminal, being led to the exit, my thoughts racing as fast as my steps. I was calm on the outside, but inside I was boiling. Not only was I removed from the plane, I was humiliated, my rights were violated, and I felt it in every fiber of my being. This was not just an incident, it was a systemic problem that I planned to expose. And I knew that today I would start a battle that would change the rules of the game. My body was already on autopilot. I followed the security guards, feeling every glance they cast at me, their attitude towards me. No one spoke to me, as if I were just an object to be manipulated. No one even considered that I might be someone important. It was easier to kick out that person who didn't fit into their ideal. But I wasn't that person. And that was the moment when I realized this flight was not accidental. It was a starting point that would open up new horizons for me. I had no right to let this become just another story that would be forgotten after a few days. My fight had already begun, and I knew how to proceed. I got off the plane and was met by several airport employees who looked as if they had just experienced something unpleasant. I realized that the situation was escalating. I was pulled off the plane not only because of my appearance, but also because I was undesirable. And the worst thing was that I immediately realized that this incident was not an isolated one. As I gathered my things, I started thinking about what to do next. What could be the next step? I took out my phone and dialed a number I had had in mind for a long time. It wasn't just a person, it was a company with so much power and influence that one phone call could change everything. "I have news for you," I said when the phone answered. And the voice of the person who answered was surprisingly calm. He didn't know that I had just been kicked off a plane, but what I told him was about to be the beginning of a plan I had been working on for years. "Withdraw your investment. All of it. Immediately." "Everything?" I said, holding my breath. My plan began right here. I had found the moment when even large companies cannot remain calm. They will be forced to start moving to avoid disaster. As soon as I uttered those words, I realized that this was a big game, and I seemed to be ready to play. I was already being led out of the airport hall, and despite the crowd staring at me, I felt superior. I had something important in my hands, something more than words could express. I was ready to change not only my own destiny, but also the destiny of those facing similar problems. And as the security guards led me away, I knew that they would find out who I really was. I reached the terminal, and my gaze fell on the news headlines. It seemed that there was already some information about the situation on board. I instantly realized that this moment could be used to create a story that no one would ever forget. I quickly took out my phone and posted a video I had filmed on board, showing everything. How I was being humiliated, how the flight attendant clearly said that I was not suitable for this seat, how the security guards were manipulating me. I knew that this video would have an impact. It was my first step. At that moment, I started receiving messages. I couldn't believe how many people had already shared my story. Within a few hours, the video went viral. Flying While Black was trending. People started sharing their stories, and every voice was another argument helping to show that I wasn't alone. And even though I wasn't ready for what was happening, I knew for sure that this would be the beginning of a new reality. And then I made a decision. It was time for real change. This was just the beginning. This moment did not happen by accident. Now I'm not just fighting for justice. I plan to completely change the system that allows companies like this to operate with impunity. And then I called the same contact again. "We're not stopping. And I'm going to do it my way." The night was difficult, but my mind was clear. I couldn't sleep because my thoughts were racing like a stormy ocean. I knew that this was just the beginning, and that my fight was only gaining momentum. Everything that happened on that plane was just part of a bigger story, and I had all the tools I needed to turn that story around. I woke up in the morning, and the first thing I did was open my laptop. I had to act fast. Thousands of people had already shared my video, but that wasn't enough. This had to be a big scandal, one that would make everyone talk about what was going on behind the scenes in this industry. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, where thousands of comments, reposts, and messages of support were pouring in immediately after publication. People were supporting me, and it was incredible. They need to know that I'm not just one voice. There are dozens, hundreds, thousands of us who have experienced this, I said to myself as I typed away on my keyboard. I sent a few messages to my lawyers, and within a few hours, we had the first steps toward a lawsuit. It turned out that the company had not only violated my rights as a passenger, but also had a habit of violating the rights of other passengers, including people from minority groups. That was all I needed to know. It became my trump card. From then on, everything happened almost automatically. However, I knew that simply filing a lawsuit was not enough. My goal was much bigger. I had to not only deal with this company, I had to create a situation where other large corporations that allow themselves to discriminate would think twice before doing so again. I had a plan. This was going to be a game changer for the entire industry. I was going to piece the whole story together and open people's eyes to how the system that gives big companies power over our lives really works. While my lawyers were working on documents and statements, I received some important news. Several people who worked at the company had contacted me. Many of them were former employees who knew about discriminatory practices in the aviation industry but had remained silent. Now they couldn't stay silent. They were ready to testify. I received a lot of information. It was exactly what I needed. It turned out that the company kept a special list of suspicious passengers, people who were usually sent to lower class or had their documents checked without reason. This included people with dark skin. They even had special training for flight attendants and staff, where they were taught to recognize wrong passengers. I had all this in my hands, and it was my weapon. All this time, the company tried to pretend that these minor incidents were accidental. I now had proof that it was a systematic policy. With all this baggage, I contacted several journalists, and we decided to work together. My story is not just my struggle. It was the struggle of everyone who experienced this injustice. As soon as the journalists started preparing their materials, I realized that we could expose not only this particular company, but the entire system that allowed them to operate with impunity. Within a few days of the video's publication, the situation with the company began to deteriorate rapidly. They tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but their actions became increasingly obvious. The first thing they did was to start refuting the information in press releases. But it was too late. Thanks to public support and the evidence gathered, several large investment companies that had previously supported the airline began to withdraw their support. I remember the moment when I received a message from one of the main investors saying that they were withdrawing their funding. It was my first big victory, but I knew that wasn't enough. My goal was to turn the entire industry upside down, force other companies to rethink their policies, and teach them that all of this has consequences. But with every victory, I felt the attacks from corporations intensifying. They weren't prepared for the media to take an interest in their dirty game. They weren't prepared for their fears to become reality. So I took the next step. I wrote a letter to the Department of Transportation demanding that all other airlines that might be using similar practices be investigated. They had a responsibility to review their procedures because this was not a problem with just one flight. Every step I took brought me closer to my goal, and I could already feel the tide turning. All these companies began to feel the consequences. I was determined to achieve justice for myself and for everyone who had suffered racial discrimination in the aviation industry. Now I knew that this was only the beginning. The fight would not be easy, but I was ready to see it through to the end. Each new day brought more confirmation that I was on the right track. With media coverage growing and support mounting, I felt the heavy machinery of systemic injustice begin to creak. This was no longer just my fight. It had become a movement. People across the country began to engage with the issue, their voices joining mine and growing louder, threatening those who had remained in the shadows for decades, hiding behind false norms and beliefs. The publication of my evidence was a turning point. The company could no longer ignore the problem. Several journalists from major media platforms began to dig deeper. They found even more evidence and, worst of all for the company, not only cases of discrimination but also corruption within the company began to surface. It seems that everything was planned. They created this system to tighten control and reduce costs by selecting suspicious passengers and subjecting them to additional checks. Meanwhile, the corporation's response to my case became increasingly aggressive. They tried to pull strings in politics, contact lawyers, and even prepared financial agreements to cover up the situation. I received several calls from lawyers offering me a lucrative deal to keep quiet and let them forget about the incident. I knew that this was only the beginning of a long fight, and now that they were trying to stop me, I had to act even more decisively. My answer was short: it won't work. I will win this fight. This wasn't just a one-day thing. It was a movement for justice. I couldn't go back to my normal life, even if I wanted to. I felt like the whole world was waiting for me to make a move, and I knew I wouldn't be alone on this journey. My next strategy was to add even more weight to my demands. I started reaching out to other organizations, community groups, and human rights advocates who supported my initiative. My campaign brought together not only activists, but also people who had experienced similar discrimination themselves. They started sending me their stories and testimonies, and I compiled them to create a large-scale movement. We weren't just gathering information about this company. We worked with other airlines, studying their passenger policies and trying to understand where similar discrimination might be hiding. And then, just when I thought I was on the home stretch, there was an unexpected twist. One evening, as I was sitting in the office reviewing new passenger testimonials, I received a phone call. It was a journalist I had been working with on the investigation. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension. "Lena, I have something important to tell you. It turns out that the company that has been consistently breaking the rules is not only discriminating against passengers, but also actively manipulating safety data," he said. "Their false reports and lobbyists have been bribing several senators to avoid rigorous inspections. This is much more serious than we thought." I heard this and couldn't believe my ears. Now I wasn't just fighting for justice in my own situation. This was a conspiracy that went to the heart of the industry. They were covering for each other, selling safety and rules for money. And at that moment, I realized that the fight would become even more difficult and dangerous. Nevertheless, I wasn't going to back down. It was a moment when I had to act decisively and quickly. I gathered all the facts, all the evidence and new investigations, and began working with human rights organizations to file lawsuits not only against the company, but also against the individuals involved in the manipulation and conspiracy. This time, as I had promised, I was not acting just for myself. My goal was much bigger, to change the system. And I knew that this process would be long and difficult, but we were ready for it. While the airline was doing everything it could to cover up its crimes, we were preparing a major press release. That was the moment when I realized that we were on the verge of a real victory. In addition, I decided to file a complaint with the Federal Aviation Administration to initiate an official review of all airlines' policies. It was a chance for global change that could stop this mechanism of injustice, not only in my case, but also in the cases of thousands of other people who had suffered from the system for years. When information about my actions spread, the company began to feel pressure. My lawyers worked day and night in offices and courtrooms, supporting my every step. At that moment, I realized that the real battle was not only in court. My mission was to change the face of an entire industry that for years had ignored or refused to acknowledge this shameful phenomenon. The process gained momentum, and although I was prepared for it, it was impossible to predict how far we would go and how big our fight would become. As I expected, at every stage, the company, which until then had considered itself invincible, tried desperately to stop us. They used every resource at their disposal: the media, political connections, lawsuits, even lobbyists. But I was ready. Every time they tried to silence the noise, it only got louder. I received countless calls from people who, like me, had experienced discrimination on board aircraft. These stories were difficult to hear, but they became my allies. They supported me, and I knew that if we didn't stop, we would achieve more than just justice for ourselves. This was a fight to change the system. My team and I weren't just fighting for compensation or for recognition of our dignity. We were fighting for every passenger, regardless of skin color or origin, to have equal rights. And even when the situation became unbearably tense, I felt that we were on the path to victory. Meanwhile, the human rights organizations that were helping me in my fight also became more active. They began initiating consultations with other airlines, urging them to review their internal policies regarding passengers and ensure equality at all stages, from check-in to boarding. Even the smallest details were important: how documents were checked, how those who differed from the standard image of the right passenger were treated. When news of my case spread and the full extent of the discriminatory policy began to emerge, the public began to demand change. This meant that companies could no longer remain inactive. After weeks of relentless investigation, we finally gained support at the highest level. Several large corporations that still had agreements with the airline began to officially withdraw from their contracts, which was a real blow to their budgets. But even when it seemed that we were close to victory, the industry did not give up. The pressure was intense. Representatives of big business, political scientists, and even some well-known figures appeared at official meetings and in courtrooms, trying to calm the situation by offering reconciliation. But there was no sign of retreat on my face. I was ready to fight to the end, not only for myself, but also for those who would never be able to do so. And then came the news that changed everything. My team discovered new, extremely important information. It turned out that the airline itself had been falsifying passenger safety data, and their screening policy did not meet safety requirements on board. This was more than just a violation of standards. It was a deliberate conspiracy to manipulate and mislead regulators. That was the turning point when I decided that everything I had done up to that point had to come to an end. I filed a lawsuit not only against the company itself, but also against several of its senior executives who were directly involved in these manipulations. Each of them had to be held accountable for their actions, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that justice was served. We not only demanded compensation for the victims, but also sought changes in policies regarding passenger data checks and processing. This case was supposed to bring about real change, not only for the company, but for the entire industry. Just a few days after filing the lawsuit, I received word that the Aviation Administration had agreed to a full investigation of the company and possibly even revoke the licenses of several other airlines if they were found to be involved in similar practices. I felt that justice was coming, and although I could no longer back down, I knew that change was becoming a reality. In the end, I decided not only to fight through the courts, but also to create an initiative that would promote equality in aviation and ensure fairness for every passenger, regardless of their skin color or origin. The idea was simple: create an organization that would certify airlines that adhere to ethical standards and equality and begin international audits. But most importantly, I finally realized that we shouldn't rely solely on other companies or the system to bring about change. We had to become the ones who changed the rules, and we could do it.